Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Manchester Poetry Library at Manchester Metropolitan University. And this is one of the very few poetry libraries in the country, and it's the only free public members poetry library based within a university. And you can join the poetry library from anywhere. I am at CLPE down in London at the minute, but I still have my Manchester Poetry Library membership card. You don't have to be a Manchester resident. Get yourself up there. The Manchester Poetry Library opened almost 2 years ago now in September 2021 with around 10,000 books of poetry. And each of the Poetry Library's collections has been carefully co-curated with poets, artists and readers. And they currently have more than 15,000 books. It's their collection of verse novels aimed at teenagers and young adults that's most relevant at our event today. So my name is Charlotte Hacking, and I have the great privilege of working as the Learning and Programme Director for CLPE, but I also have the great privilege of editing the verse novel that we're going to talk about today, and that is The Final Year by Matt Goodfellow, illustrated by Joe Todd Stanton and published by Otter Barry Books. And Matt Goodfellow is a prolific poet. He's got a long-standing relationship with the Manchester Poetry Library and the Manchester Writing School that is also located at Manchester Metropolitan. His work appeared in our CLPE Clipper Poetry Award, shortlisted anthology Let in the Stars, which was published by the Manchester Writing School at Manchester Metropolitan University, and his collection Being Me, that was also shortlisted for the Clipper Poetry Award, written with Liz Brownlee and Laura Muka, was launched as part of a series of online events that the Manchester Poetry Library ran during the year before they officially opened their doors. So we're here today to introduce Matt, who is a multi-shortlisted and award-winning poet launching The Final Year, which is his first novel written in verse. And shortly, I'm going to be inviting Matt to tell us a little bit about the book and to share some of it with us. Then I'm going to be introducing two guests who found The Final Year really interesting in terms of their field of research. Professor of Socio-Linguistics, Dr. Rob Drummond, who is also the founder of Manchester Voices, and his colleague, Dr. Ian Cushing, a former teacher, who's now Senior Lecturer in Applied Linguistics here at Manchester Metropolitan University. They're going to tell us a little bit about their work before we open the conversation more broadly to a discussion about the importance of celebrating the diversity of voice. We're also going to end the event by telling you about a free schools event for years 5, 6 and 7 that's going to happen here in Manchester on the 20th of September, and also about the plans for the final year for National Poetry Day, which we'll all be celebrating in October. So I'm going to start with Matt. Matt, after the huge success with your poetry collections and your picture book, Shulin's Grandpa, which was shortlisted for the Kate Greenaway Award for Illustration, you've chosen to write The Final Year as a verse novel. You've also chosen to write it in the authentic dialect of the characters. And I wondered if you could tell us what inspired you to tell this particular story, and particularly in this way.
Yeah, hi Charlotte. It's great to be here. Yeah, what I wanted to do was tell an authentic story, and anything that I write is generally a combination of three things: my life, lives that I've seen, and stuff that I make up. And this was a story that a lot of it I had seen when I was working as a teacher in Manchester. I was a primary school teacher in East Manchester for over 10 years, and it's a lot of the stuff that happens within the story actually happened. And what I wanted to do was let the characters tell their story in their voice, voices that they could be proud of, voices that they spoke in every day. And it kind of fitted with the stuff that I was talking about in schools as a visiting poet, talking about the importance of voice and accent and dialect. And it just stemmed from there, really. It was a story that sort of needed telling. It took a while to write it, but it was a story that I wanted to tell, and yeah, hopefully it has a power to it.
And I think you're going to introduce us to a bit of the story now, aren't you? Because you're going to read from the opening of the book, which serves to give us a bit of a flavour about where the story's set, who's involved in the story, and gives us an introduction to that voice that you've written the book in.
Yeah, I'll read you a few of the poems right at the start of the book. This is from the section called Before We Begin, and the poem starts with, "You need to be able to pin this down. You need to be able to pin this down so you can see it in your mind as it plays out. Picture where it's happening. Imagine it's summer, a hot one. Leave the suburban semis to their leaf dreams and head for the city, straight into the streets that surround the centre. See how things are different. It's tighter here. Can you feel it? See the takeaways in the neon-washed litter, the disfigured pigeons huddled under railway bridges and flyovers, taxis, buses, pizza boxes, vape shops. This is not a place of Labradors and lattes and electric Audis. This is a place of staffies and cider and exhaust pipe smoke, a place of one foot in front of the other brother, because what else are you going to do? See that tall, skinny kid with a ball in his hand saying, see you later to his mate. That's me, Nathan Wilder, Nate. 10 years old and a week away from the end of year 5. One more thing. The woman over there pushing the buggy, hair scraped up in a top knot, heading to the shop for milk and cider. A little kid dressed as Spider-Man trailing behind her. That's Mum. The kid's Dylan, my nearly 4-year-old nuisance of a littlest brother, always up to no good, straight out any open door. The bigger kid further back, kicking stones along the road, ignoring Mum's shouts to get a move on. That's Jackson, or Jax as everyone calls him. My other brother, 8 years old. He's all right. Nearly forgot the school you can see right next to the park in the middle of the estate. The one with the fancy new cladding the council are putting on top of all the crumbling bricks and calling it regeneration. The one with the main road right next to it, rattling the cladding back off, and the corner shop opposite the main gates where Mum's heading to. That's Poppyfield Primary, my school. These are my streets. These are my people. This is my story.
That's a great place for us to introduce our next speaker, Rob Drummond. Now, Rob's done specific work in his field, focusing on exploring the accents, the dialects, and the identities of people in Greater Manchester, where the final year is set. Rob, I wonder if we can bring you here in here for now to tell us a little bit about the Manchester Voices project and how you responded to the final year when you read it in relation to your work.
Yeah, thanks. So the Manchester Voices project, we did it over about 3.5 years. Started in May 2019, and it was really a socio-linguistics project looking at accents and dialects and identities. But it was done in a very community-focused way. So rather than, quite a lot of studies in this area of sort of language study, we kind of send some experts in and they record some people and we analyze their accents and we write about it, and it goes off to other academics to read about it. But this was very much, we wanted it to be, the people in Greater Manchester, them being the experts and telling us what they thought about the way they speak. And yeah, of course, we were listening to them and analyzing their accents, but we were much more interested in what they said about the way they speak and how they feel about it, and how it makes them, how it relates to their sense of who they are, and how they perceive other people within the region. And so kind of from that, we got loads of insights into how accents are changing and how accents are kind of differ across the different regions. But we also got a real sense of accent pride, especially in younger people, which was really nice to see, because it hasn't always been the case. It hasn't always been that people are really proud of the way they speak. Often there's a sort of prestige accents, and there are other accents where people are trying to almost change the way they speak because they feel they have to and they're under pressure. And it was quite nice that perhaps there was sort of evidence to suggest perhaps this pressure is changing and people are able to have much more, explicit pride in the way they speak. So it was with all of that background, reading the final year was fascinating, because now I knew Matt's background, so I knew kind of where it was it was set. But then I was reading it as if I was trying to read it as if I didn't know, and to think what's there to tell me, you know, where it's set. And there are quite a few things. I think very early on you get an idea that it's certainly a kind of northern England, and you can tell this. There are just sort of telltale things, like he rhymes the word laughs with maths, which doesn't rhyme for me because I'm not from around here, but sort of laughs and maths, and so you know then it's placed in the north of England. And this is what we do in my area of linguistics, is we listen out for individual sounds. You know, accents vary. We think of accents being very different, but really it's only a few sounds which vary, and that holds all of those differences. So we listen out for these telltale sounds. So once we know it's in the north of England, but then there are some really lovely kind of rhymes or just words which tells us it's Manchester. It's in that Manchester area. And things like you've got things like mint, things being described as mint. That's very kind of northwest, very Manchester. Or things like using proper, saying something's proper good, or it's like it said proper head back snorting, proper something. That's very Manchester. And minging as well, describing something as minging is Manchester. But there are loads of just generally so-called non-standard ways of speaking, and it's that which just sets it. Not necessarily localized, it doesn't matter, but the fact is it's somebody's voice away from the mainstream, away from the standard, and that's kind of evidenced throughout. And so it's just a really lovely way of writing, I think, and a lovely way of reading.
I think that's really interesting to pick up on, Rob, because editing the book, I'm from South London, and I would have spoken in a South London accent. So there were enough markers, like the laughs and the maths, that said, okay, that's not me. But there were enough markers to say, actually, bits of that are common with the language that I would have used when I was a kid as well. Why do you think it's really important for that book to be used in that way? Or what potential do you think it has to be used in the classroom to open up broader conversations about children's voices?
I think it's just the fact that it uses language in a different way. It uses anybody reading it, any young person reading it will just recognize that this isn't the sort of language they'll see in other books, and so they'll kind of clock that difference, and they'll know that it's more like they speak. Because you're exactly right. There are certain things which make it a bit northern. There are certain things which make it specifically Manchester. But there's a whole load of stuff which just makes it not how maybe they're used to the teacher speaking, or how they're used to seeing things written down elsewhere. So I think it's giving children the permission to do that, that kind of showing that there's value in all different forms of language, that that any hierarchy of language is completely arbitrary. There's nothing objectively better or worse than any way of speaking compared to another. And so I think it gives children that permission and that license to recognize themselves in the writing, and then hopefully then be able to create their own.
And I think that's the most perfect segue to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Ian Cushing. And Ian's done a lot of work, he's done a broad spectrum of work to segment what he's done into this short time that we've got with him. But Ian specifically looked at language ideologies in a classroom context, which moves on a little bit from what you said, Rob. And Ian, I wonder if we can bring you in at this point to talk a little bit about your work following on from what Rob's just said, and again, how you've responded to the final year in relation to specifically what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks so much, Charlotte. It's such an honour to be here. I'll just talk for a few minutes about my work and how that relates to Matt's brilliant book. So my own work has really looked at education policy and practice, and how that stigmatizes children from working class backgrounds. And my work critiques what sociolinguists often refer to as deficit perspectives. And deficit perspectives generally refer to attitudes about language which frame racially marginalized or socially class marginalized communities as lacking in linguistic abilities, as unable to produce adequate language, that they require some kind of correction in their language, and so on. And so through these perspectives and these attitudes, marginalized children often end up being described as coming from broken homes, for example, where there might be very little culture, that they have no interest in language or books or reading or writing, that there's often a lack of love in their family home, that they live in so-called language poor or impoverished environments. And, you know, deficit perspectives are really, really durable. They can be very, very difficult to challenge. They're very, very deeply embedded. But it's really an ideology that blames marginalized children for these supposed shortcomings, as opposed to the broader structural inequalities and challenges and barriers that they might experience. So my own research has really showed how contemporary policy, particularly at the moment, is particularly marked by some of those perspectives and ideologies, but also how teachers might get positioned within that system. So my work has critiqued the kinds of tests about grammar, for example, and reading that primary school children must take, which of course NATE has to go through in the final year. But of course he was doing that whilst having to navigate all of the other trauma that he was experiencing as a result of Dylan's illness, as well as the more general difficulties of being an 11-year-old. So thinking about my work in relation to the final year, then, well, first of all, I think it's really important to say how I just love the way that Matt represents Nate's capacity for language, and how his love for language just shines through despite all of the things that are going on in his life. And that's really important to me, because so often in my work, I see how schools and education policymakers consistently frame children like Nate as illiterate, as having a limited vocabulary, as unable to articulate themselves properly, and so on. Whereas Matt's depiction of Nate completely rejects those very dangerous labels and just demonstrates so clearly how he is able to produce exactly the kind of rich, dexterous and creative language that middle-class children are so often praised for producing. So I also saw aspects of my work when thinking about the representation of Mr. Joshua and Nate's teacher, and how he as a teacher is really positioned as having to prepare children for these reductive tests, which in Mr. Joshua's own words are kind of just hoops that you have to jump through, which is a direct line from the book. And I love how Matt's work really targets this critique at the policy context and at the tests, and sees those as the problem rather than the individual teachers within that system. And it's the policy context which continuously produces those deficit perspectives, those prescriptive grammar tests, those reductive reading and writing assessments. And because of the high stakes nature of those tests, teachers can sometimes be coerced into reproducing those deficit assumptions that underpin those tests. So for children like Nate, then, whose kind of language and creativity and dexterous language practices just transcends and just goes beyond those tests, often for children like that, their voice just isn't allowed ever to be heard. It isn't granted that legitimacy that Rob was talking about, and he isn't given that opportunity to see himself represented in the contents of those SATs papers. And there's a really lovely moment actually on page 242 when Nate himself actually critiques the testing institution and how it's complete failure to recognise his own creative capacity for language. So he talks about how the reading papers are stupid and how some muppet claims to know that language can be reduced to right and wrong answers. And that really gets to the heart of what my own work is about, and about pushing back against those very reductive binary ways of thinking about language. And that's really why I think Matt's work is so powerful, especially for teachers who, in a bit like what Mr. Joshua is trying to do, want to challenge the kind of deficit thinking that sadly is so pervasive in schools today. So yeah, that's how I see my work connecting to Matt's brilliant book.
And just in the same way that I asked Rob, Ian, what do you see as the kind of broader kind of ideologies that we could explore outside of this? When you were thinking about that deficit model and children being critiqued by the way they speak, I was immediately thinking of someone like Angela Rayner. The minute she opens her mouth, the conversation steers from around what she's saying, the depth of what she's saying, to how she's saying it. Do you think there's a place and a space in the classroom to open up those conversations about accents and dialect using a book like this? And what do you think it might offer children more broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. There's absolutely a space for it, and there should be a space for it. And indeed, I know many brilliant teachers who are wanting to engage in some more critical conversations about language and class and race and power and inequalities in their classroom, and are refusing to accept this notion that classrooms are these depoliticized spaces, right? They're deeply political spaces where critical and politicized conversations about language should happen. And really, when you look at the content of the curriculum and the policy and the test that Matt's critiquing, unfortunately, that offers very, very little spaces for teachers who want to engage in that more critical work. But through the use of fictional texts and non-fictional texts like the one that we're talking about today, what I found certainly in my own work and talking to teachers is that these kinds of texts offer a brilliant entry point and a kind of starting point as a place to generate and facilitate those more critical conversations about language and power and inequality, and just normalizing and legitimizing the kind of linguistic variation that's so nicely and richly represented in the book. So fictional texts offer this kind of great starting point to just open up these conversations about language that all children want to engage in. And indeed, it's so easy for teachers to do that, given the richness and the wealth of diversity that teachers have got within their very classrooms.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Ian. Well, Ian's obviously read the book very thoroughly and given us quite a few insights as to what's going to happen in the story moving forward. So I'm going to ask us to switch back to Matt, who's going to introduce us to a poem that's a little bit later in the novel, to talk about how poetry can help children to make sense of their experiences and use their voices.
Okay, so I'm going to read you a poem. This is called Oh, So You Want to Know About the Beast, right? Okay, so it first happened in year 2. Though Mum says I was always throwing tantrums when I was proper little. But on this day, something happened to spark it, to release it. Can't even remember what it was. Someone nicked my pencil maybe, or a push in the line on the way back from assembly. All I remember is from somewhere really deep down in me, I feel a darkness rising, but like a hot darkness, like fire and smoke all mixed together, and my fists are flames. And the next thing I know, I'm curled up in the sunshine room, crying and cold. And man, I'm tired, so tired. And my teacher, Miss Nolan's rubbing my back, and the whole room's in bits. The whole world is. I've been carried out of the classroom with a chunk of some poor kid's ponytail in my hand. It happened again a week later. So they got Mum in, and she had to come to meetings at school to talk about my issues. And then I had to go see this woman every week, Miss Huff, a counsellor, to talk and draw and find a way to keep the beast at bay. 2 years it took us. 2 years of talking and drawing and learning to breathe in a way that let me control that beast rather than it controlling me. So if you see me starting to breathe in a strange way, right, I ain't crazy or nothing. I'm self-regulating in it.
That is a perfect poem to lead forward into thinking about how your poetry has always provided a space and a place for children to see themselves and others and their own experiences reflected in meaningful ways. I've known your work, I've had the privilege of knowing your work for many years through the CLPE Poetry Award, the Clipper, and consistently in all of your collections, you bring poems to the forefront that really do go to places that other poetry doesn't, that shine a light on experiences that children go through personally, but in really meaningful and authentic ways. And the final year is no exception to this. It's got a very real and authentic account of the final year of primary, the joys, the uncertainties within it, and the very real experiences, like Ian said, of a family that are going through the highs and lows of everyday life. I just wondered, Matt, what do you hope when you're writing that your readers gain from your poetry, and what do you hope it offers them in terms of seeing their own lives and experiences reflected and those of others?
Well, I when I was a kid, I had quite a difficult childhood, and I lived between 2 houses, neither of which were a home really, and I struggled at school to understand why my life seemed to be so different than the lives of like my mates, and nobody, when I was at school, like, because I was naturally quite clever and I could be funny and I was all right at sports, people just assumed that I was okay. Like, nobody told me there was a space called poetry where I could find a shape for the thoughts that were going on inside my head and do it away from the sort of age-related expectations and stuff like that. That's gone. I had to find it through songwriting, through pretty bad songwriting, to be honest, when I was at high school, you know. And when I became a primary school teacher, I began to see so many lives in front of me. You know, people were struggling at times, and I think poetry can be a reflection of those things. And when I first started writing poems again, I was told by quite a lot of people, "Oh no, you can't write poems about that. That's too sad." And I was like, well, that was my life. These are the lives that I'm seeing. There was an idea within the publishing industry that we shouldn't be talking about things that, you know, we shouldn't be talking about sadness. We shouldn't be talking about death, loss, grief. And I was like, these are lives. So my aim really is to allow everybody to see that whatever their experiences of life are, they're valid, and whatever the voice of that they've grown up with, you know, their experiences of life, that they're also valid. And that's what I'd like young people to see, you know, and teachers to see, to understand that there are, and every good teacher will know that there'll be children in their classroom who have experiences that maybe some of the other kids don't, and it's about being able to say, you know, that you're not on your own, and that's really what I try to do. So I write for me, selfishly, for me, but I also try to, give young people the idea that this is life, you know, and it's okay, and it's difficult at times, but it's all right.
I think that's really interesting, the point you brought up about the challenge you've had in writing your own poetry and what is and isn't licensed to write about in children's poetry, because certainly from what we've seen through the Clipper shadowing scheme, where children have engaged specifically with your poetry, we've seen children who've been able to engage with poems to work through and make sense of some quite difficult experiences they've had in their own lives. I remember the year that Bright Bursts of Colour was shortlisted, we had a boy who used your poem Grandpa's Shoes to actually be the first segue into talking about the loss of his granddad. And we had something similar. You were recently working with us at CLPE on the Big Amazing Poetry Project with Macmillan, and we had a similar thing with your poem Blackbirds, that gave a child license to talk about the loss of a grandparent there as well. And I think it's really important that children get that so that they can see their experiences mirrored and reflected, and the experiences of others mirrored in poems that they've read, but they can also use that as the springboard for writing and for getting that voice out. And that can often be quite difficult for teachers to do in the constraints of the national curriculum. So I think we're going to move on to your next reading aloud, that's going to allow us to explore how you've tackled that very real experience from your perspective of being a teacher, of how you slot those kinds of things into a curriculum that can seem very overcrowded and very linear and very narrow in the way that Ian said about how we teach language. So we're going to hand over to you to read 2 more poems from the final year.
Are we reading 2? I thought we were doing 1. Let's do the one that
I
thought.
Like me to say, we're going to do all through year 5. They've been telling us, and then we're going to do at the end of the day.
That's right. Fine. Okay. Yeah. This is teachers. There's so much pressure on teachers. When I was a primary school teacher, I'm a very disorganized man, as you've generally just seen. And I was a year 6 teacher for a long time, and there is so much pressure on teachers to push people into boxes that they don't necessarily agree with. Yeah, this is called All Through Year 5. They've been telling. This is as Nate is about to move from year 5 to year 6. All through year 5, they've been telling us the next year will be tough, that we'd better be prepared for it, that it's a stepping stone to high school, that it's time to show what we can do, that it's SATs, that it's boosters and revision, that it's a fishbowl. Everyone looks at the year 6s, that it's time to knuckle down and focus, that it's all worth it in the end, that it's the most important year of our lives so far, and we need to act like it. that it's all going to change after this year, so we need to enjoy it while we can, that we're going to make ourselves proud, that it's time for us to step up and become top of the school, that it's the final year. And what else was I reading, Charlotte?
So we were going to go on to talk about how teachers can be an inspiration for children to open up their voices in poetry. So you were going to read At the End of the Day to illustrate and highlight that.
Yeah, I can't find where that is now. So
it's a lovely poem that shows that integral role that Ian was talking about earlier of what a good teacher can do in a constricted curriculum to really open children's eyes up to the fact that they do have the power to have a voice outside of all of those constraints that they're facing, if a teacher can recognise and give that segue to them.
Yeah, I can't find that poem. So what I'll do instead is I'll talk to you about. Let me give you the moment of crystallization for me as a teacher working in East Manchester. When I began to start thinking about this, because I was a teacher, as all teachers are, we have to demonstrate standard spoken English within the classroom, standard spoken English. And there was a lad when I was an NQT, my first year as a teacher, there was a lad in my class that said, where I was working, kids would say, "Can I go toilet?" And as a teacher, what I would have to say is, I think you mean, "Can I go to the toilet?" And this went on for a little bit. And one day this kid said to me, he said, "Here, Mr. Goodfellow, right? How come you tell me it's wrong to say, 'Can I go toilet?' when my dad says, 'Can I go toilet?' and when my granddad says, 'Can I go toilet?'" And it got me thinking about it. It got me thinking that, you know, that was his cultural heritage. That was his right to speak like that. Okay, this is a poem called At the End of the Day. It's on page 103. At the end of the day, Mr. Joshua calls me over to his desk. "Hey, Nate, I just wanted to say that poem you wrote was beautiful. There was something about it that just grabbed me, made me feel something, you know. And that's what the best writing does, Nate. It's the feels you're looking for." He opens his drawer. "You got a notebook or anything that you keep ideas in?" I shake my head. "Just a pile of old paper, sir." He passes me a notebook, a proper posh little hardback black one. "Here," he says, "have this. I keep one around like I used to in the bands. You got to grab those ideas when they come or else they're gone forever, you know." And he waves his hand above his head, trying to grab something in there. "No one used to tell me to write my ideas down, Nate, but they were just knocking on the inside of my head until I did. Just like the poet in the video. And you, I think you have the flow. You have to grab that pen, Nate, let it all go." He spins his chair around and types something into Google. "Now look at this. These are David Allman's notebooks. They're on display up in the Northeast. See all those mad swirls of words and pictures? If you've got it in you, Nate, which I'm pretty certain you do, it's what you can do too." And he spins back round to look at me. Proper kind look in his eyes. It helps you process the world, you know? All that heavy stuff we have to carry. Then he glances at his watch. "Oops, staff meeting. I've got to go, Nate. See you tomorrow."
Thank you very much. Now, your former experience of working as a teacher and your experience of working in a school really shines throughout the book, and because there's a real understanding, I think, of what it is to operate, as Ian said, in the current education system and its constraints, and also how we as teachers, as we heard in that poem, can help children to find themselves and their voices in reading and writing. You've been very open throughout the book and in the acknowledgements to the impact that David Allman's particularly had on you as a writer, and seeing his voice on the page and how that's inspired you to use your voice on the page. But I also want to think about what we think that poetry offers in this sense that other experiences might not. So I wonder if you could talk about that dual aspect of seeing your voice reflected on the page in reading, but also poetry as that space to open up your voice for writing.
Yeah, poetry tends to be a funny thing, you know. We kind of see poems wheeled out at like funerals and weddings and stuff, and we, you know, we recognise they're important, and then that's okay there, but it's not for me. And you know, inherent within the education system, I think quite often, and this is nothing to do with teachers, the way the education system generally happens, as I see it, is that young people are pumped out of high school seeing poetry as something that isn't for them, as an elitist, esoteric thing. That you know, I've got a 17-year-old son who loves grime music, who loves rap, but who sees poetry, even though I'm a poet, who sees poetry as not relevant to his life. So if we have this situation where young people are constantly coming out, you know, some of those young people grow up to be teachers, and so when I became a teacher, poetry was a sort of bolt-on unit that people had to do if they really had to do it, and really I began to sort of look at some of the brilliant writings, the educational writings of people like Michael Rose, and begin to look at and go, actually, well, you know, we can do different things here. And I believe poetry in the current education system, poetry allows teachers to facilitate creativity in a completely different way. And really, I believe it's the only space currently where teachers can get young people writing in their voice about their life. You know, and that's one of the important things, I think, is sometimes, because teachers are so busy, and often if you're a teacher that carries this nervousness about poetry because of the education system, you then train to be a teacher, there's a rigidity to the education system, and it becomes to be a bit, you kind of lose autonomy in your own classroom. You know, because you've got to do all this stuff. I think poetry gives you, the teacher and the children, that space to reflect lives, to reflect the lives of the young people in front of them, to allow the teacher to do that without the fear that somebody's going to walk into the room and say, you know, this isn't a year 6 poem because it doesn't contain this or this or this. It really does create that space. And quite often I find when I'm working in schools and I'm working with teachers, it needs that message sharing. You know, people need to say it to you, that poetry does all of this stuff, and you know, getting poetry into schools on a daily basis allows, I think, the education, you know, the teachers and the children to begin to understand that poetry can do whatever it wants. You know, it's like mercury, and to do that is really important, I think. So I think that's the space poetry can provide, even within the horrible constrictions, in my opinion, of the current education system. It gives teachers that chance to facilitate that, to let the kids and the young people talk about their lives.
I think that's really interesting, because we certainly find that through our research as the National Poetry Centre for Primary Schools, CLPE, teachers get turned off of poetry, particularly in secondary school, because it all comes down to analysing language, and within a very strict limitation of what language is and what it could be. And the essence of poetry is lost, and the poetry, you know, is about expressing thoughts and feelings and experiences in a way that connects with other people, in a way that makes them think something or feel something. And that's often the last thing that we go back to when we're looking at poetry in that very analytical way. We're not starting from that point of what does it make us think about, how does it make us feel, and then what makes us feel this way. And it's been quite brave for you to write in dialect. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the decisions that you made in terms of wanting to represent dialect authentically, and maybe some of the inspirations in writers that you've read that have allowed you to see that as a place and a space for you.
Yeah, I've always been into, so we, you know, the book is partly a love letter to David Ormond, and David Ormond and Alan Garner inspired me a lot when I was a kid. I've always liked writers that ground stuff in place. You know, you can kind of tell when people are proud of the place that they're from, and even it just interested me. And to be honest, I started writing it, and it wasn't like that. And it was changed midway through, and I think we talked about that during the editing in stuff, that actually this could be a vehicle to show people that whatever their accent is, whatever their cultural heritage is, that there is a space, there is a validity and an authenticity to that voice that has a power. You know, and I believe that the stuff that I was saying about my son Will listening to grime music, you know, that he's been exposed all the time to voices that are proud of their heritage, grounded in place. And I just wanted to give Nate his voice, you know, the voice that he'd grown up with, and the voice that he could be proud of. You know, nobody owns language, and I think that within the book, hopefully, we can see that Nate is able to master language rather than allowing language to be his master, you know, and that's really what I wanted to do.
And you've done that really authentically, because you've looked at different ways that Nate uses language as well. Sometimes when he's writing some of the poetry, he does go into standard language because that's the way that feels right for him. And I think that's a really powerful message for children to hear, that they are in control of the language. They can see when their language shines, their dialect shines, and when they need to harness standard spoken English to create the effects that they want to create in writing. And again, that's a really powerful thing to teach children. If we're going to get to those higher level skills in the curriculum, like authorial intent, we've got to know what we're doing and why we're doing it and what impact we want to have on our readers. And that brings us back to the work of all of you that we've talked to this afternoon. And I wonder if we can bring Ian and Rob back in at this point, because it would be good to draw everything that we've been discussing this afternoon together to think about why we think it's really important for children to be able to tell their own stories in their own voices. And in this difficult school context and this constrained curriculum that we're working in, how is it that we can really show children that their voices matter? I wonder if we can think about maybe one practical solution each between the three of you of how to actually do that actively and practically. Matt, do you want to start us off?
I think the most important thing that we can do in classrooms is expose children and young people to poetry, expose them to videos of poets so they can see poets come from all around the world, all different accents, all different voices, and I think that frees both the teacher and the children. It opens up a discussion, and it also opens up the discussions about punctuation, about, you know, it's about the young people's choices. That here this is a space, I believe, where you have the choice. I'm not saying for a second that you have to write in your accent. It's about, this is your choice. This is a space where you can make the decisions.
I think that's a really powerful thing to say, and again, it's why at CLPE we produce those videos for the shortlist of the CLPE Poetry Award every year, so that children can directly connect with the poets and their voices. Is there anyone specifically, Matt, poet-wise, that you would recommend people listen to? I know we've talked in the past about the power of people like Nikita Gill and some of the kind of stigmatization that she gets sometimes because of her accent and dialect, and how listening to those voices increases children's exposure to that variety of voices that they will hear in everyday society to break some of those barriers down.
Yeah, lots of poets of Caribbean heritage beautifully do the stuff we're talking about. So Benjamin Zephaniah, Val Bloom, John Agard, these are poets who are proud of who they are. They are proud of the voices and the accents of their parents. They are proud of this beautiful blend of accent that they have. And then really, I think it's just moving on to find the poets who speak to the individual child or young person, you know, and moves them in some way. And just taking it from there, opening up the conversation, start it and see where you get to.
Yeah, and it's about children finding those likes, those preferences, what tunes their ear into language as well. And as well as the videos on the CLP website, we should also make mention of the Children's Poetry Archive, which has got a wide breadth and range of recorded performances by children's poets as well, that allows children to open their ears to different kinds of language. Rob, if I come to you now, let's think about that question again, and why it is important for children to be able to tell their own stories in their own voices, and how we can do that in a school context. How can we show children that their voices matter?
Yeah, I think it's crucial that we do, in terms of, you know, using your own voice. The way you speak, the way you use language is such a big part of who you are, and regardless of your accent, whatever accent you have, it's something about your background, your upbringing, your social network, your friends, all of these things, and it's your way of presenting yourself to the world. And so I think it's vital that, you know, we kind of celebrate that importance. But for me, I think, as well as what Matt said about having you know, exposing people to all different types of language and all different varieties, then I'm really into the idea of encouraging people to notice those differences. So obviously, you know, that's kind of what I work in all the time, is noticing very small differences in the way people use language. But it's a really useful thing to be able to do. And while I'm very much against the kind of testing that goes on in this age group in terms of really decontextualized grammar testing and punctuation testing and all these kind of things about identifying different types of words just for the sake of it, for no real purpose, or suggesting there's right and wrong answers to all of these language things, I'm very much against that. But I'm very much in favor of analyzing language, of looking at language, and this is a way of exploring language in a meaningful way. And so I think everybody should be better at knowing more about language. I think it's a really important skill to have, and the power of language, and how slight differences can you know, create such big kind of impacts. And we do that by learning about how language works. But you know, if that's done in a decontextualized way, it's almost meaningless, I think. But doing it this way, so really getting young people to notice the differences. What is it, you know, in this book, for example, what is making it different from how you would speak, and you know, precisely what it is. And it's just those small things. And I think getting into that discussion then makes people reflect on the way they would use that language, and then you can start comparing, and what would it mean to you. And something Matt said earlier on about you know, somebody, you know, kind of thinking about the way, having to correct, as a teacher, supposedly having to correct the way somebody speaks, when that's the same way that his brother speaks, and his father speaks, and his granddad speaks. You're never just criticizing somebody's speech, you're criticizing the whole community, and you could be part of that community, and it becomes a really problematic thing. So I just think, yeah, noticing, making mini linguists out of everyone, just noticing how language works with no judgment, just noticing, and I think is really important.
Yeah, there's something else about that. There's the noticing, and then there's the bringing to life. So how do you actually bring that to life on the page? You know, how do you show those nuances in language in the way that something's written down? And that's a quite high level skill for children to work on as well. Fantastic. Ian, over to you to finish us off, to think about how we might show children that their voices matter and the importance of that in the classroom.
Yeah, so for me, one of the most practical things that teachers can do is really take a more critical stance on language in order to challenge and disrupt some of those ideologies that we've been talking about. And if we think about some of the characters, especially like Nate in the book, who is marginalized on a number of levels, and you know, children like Nate are so often stigmatized because of their perceived lack of language, their inferior grammar, gaps in their vocabulary, an impoverished culture, etc., in ways which simply don't happen for more privileged children, you know. But those are simply perceptions, right? They're grounded in language ideologies rather than rooted in any kind of objective or empirical reality about language. I mean, look at the creativity, the sophistication, the nuance, the complexity in Nate's language, yet those kinds of descriptors are so often associated with more privileged children. And that's just symptomatic of these very deep misalignments, really, between policy and reality. And so I think for me, giving children the space to use, to see, and to hear their own language practices in a way which builds on and sustains what they can already do with language, rather than schools starting out from the assumption that they've got limitations and gaps and absences which need fixing and closing, is an immediately practical thing that teachers can do. So if you're a school or a teacher listening to this and you're interested in social justice, then working critically with language should be central to those efforts. You know, for me and so many other critical sociolinguists out there, there's no social justice without linguistic justice. And developing that critical awareness about language is not the complete solution, but it is a fundamental starting point to challenging those ideologies that we've spoken about today, and that indeed Nate and his teacher are trying to push back against.
I think that's such an important thing to leave us with, particularly post-COVID, when that deficit narrative seems to be coming to the fore even more. now, and it's a real thing that we need to think about in the classroom, to think about how we're breaking against that narrative rather than leaning into it, because a lot of the stuff that we're seeing coming into policy and coming into the research that's cited in policy is still citing a lot of that deficit narrative that you've talked about, Ian, so thank you for leaving us with that. I think it'd be great to come back to the book to finish us now. And Matt, I'm just wondering if you'd like to leave us with a final reading from the book now, with a little bit of explanation as to why you've chosen this particular poem, which is going to be Tonight I Dream of You.
This is a poem that I like, basically. And it comes at a point when Nate's little brother is really poorly, and he's sort of really having to examine the thoughts in his head. We were helped out a lot by a paediatric cardiologist at Manchester Children's Hospital called Dr. Edmund J. Ladgesand. So I'd like to thank him for the help. He was really brilliant, actually, at treating Dylan as if he was a flesh and blood patient. So thank you, Tim, and thanks very much, Rob and Ian, for being here. It's been a pleasure to be with you guys. Tonight I dream of you. You know I've been walking. You know I've been walking to you all night. When you're propped on your pillow, the early morning light caught in your hair. And you say to me, Natey, why have you come so far? And I say, Dylan, because I need you to know. I need you to know that I came all this way because I care. Each step, each breath is for you. And you smile and lay back on your pillow. And as you close your eyes, you whisper to me, I love you, big brother. And now wings of light fold around you as you sleep. And outside the world is liquid. The world is liquid. But I am flesh and blood. And you are my brother.
That's a perfect poem to finish this event. And actually, we have had, I couldn't have picked a better panel to host this event with. This is the first of 3 events that have been put on to launch the book. But I think for me, this is such a crucial one, because we've brought together the writer of the book, who's trying to do something new and different with language and authenticity of character, and 2 experts in their field who are trying to do the same in the research industry. And, you know, as Ian left us with, what we've really got to fight for is children not seeing language as a deficit. Exactly what Matt said, children seeing that their language is power. And hopefully this event has inspired you to start thinking about what you can do in the classroom to reinforce that with all of your children. If you are in the Manchester area and this event has inspired you, I also need to tell you about the next event, which is happening on September the 20th. And the Manchester Poetry Library are hosting an event here at Manchester Metropolitan University for schools. Now, if you're a teacher or if you're a home educator and you wish to bring a group of Year 5, Year 6 or Year 7 pupils along, you can book via the Eventbrite link, which is currently advertised on the Poetry Library website. Matt's going to be reading from the book for children there, and we can guarantee that your pupils are going to leave inspired to create their own stories in their own voices. And there might be also a few surprises involving some pupils from Sacred Heart Primary School, because they're going to be reading the final year over the summer break. On September the 27th, we're going to be hosting the industry launch event for the final year. Invites will be going out to that shortly. And if you're invited to that, please do come along and join us for that event. We're also on National Poetry Day going to be launching a competition centred around the final year. And you'll have heard Matt read that powerful poem earlier about Mr. Joshua giving Nate a hardback notebook to find his voice and to write his own poems in his voice about how he lives his life. And we're going to be encouraging you to do the same. We want you to write in your voice about your life. And the National Poetry Day website will be the source of information for how to get involved in that. And there is a specifically designed teacher resource to start you off with that competition. And last but not least, after hearing the book and after hearing us have those wide-ranging discussions about it, you're probably looking to buy a copy of it. And I have to announce at the end of this that the lovely Simply Books in Cheadle have agreed to supply class sets at a reduced rate of £8 per book. And if you're looking to do that as an individual, the book is also on sale at other local independent bookshops. Please go to them first. Or you can order it direct from the Otter Barry website. Otter Barry Books are the publishers of the final year. If you've booked onto this event via Eventbrite, you're going to be sent the details automatically of that schools event I spoke about earlier on the 20th of September, and where you can order all of the books. And if you're just finding us on YouTube and you want to know more, you can contact Kay Chu, who has been the fantastic organizer of this event, and her email is k.chew, T-E-W, @mmu.ac.uk. I would very much like to thank Rob and Ian and Matt for joining us this afternoon. We hope that you have gained a lot from this event about inspiring your children to write in their voices about their lives, and we can't wait to see you at some of the other events or to look at your children's entries to the National Poetry Day competition. Please do keep abreast of what's happening at the Manchester Poetry Library, at MMU, and also at CLPE, and we will look forward to supporting you with more poetry and other children's literature across the year. Thanks everybody for joining us.